It's a privilege to be here with you. I wore this sweater the other day, and a homie said, gee, Mr. Rogers called. He'd like his sweater back. I got jokes. Thank you for your attention so early in the morning. I had a homie once stand in front of my desk, and very earnest guy, and he said, look, I need your divided attention. I said, you are in luck, because that is exactly what you're going to be getting. I apologize, I bumped into a bunch of people already who've heard me any number of places, and I don't know, that sort of undoes me a little bit, you know. I don't know why, and also YouTube is kind of the bane of my existence. And once I went to speak at this foster grandparent gathering, a huge gathering in Southern California. Well, I had spoken at it the summer before, and for some reason they invited me 2 summers in a row, and so I spoke, and afterwards this foster grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked the talk. She had big tears in her eyes, and she grabbed both my hands, and she said, I heard you last year. It never gets better. Yeah, kind of hoping she misspoke there, but but working at Homeboy Industries for 31 years has kept me humble. And the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands of gang members I've come to know. People like Hector, 17 years old, back in school for the very first time, works for us part-time. He was kind of an elementary school dropout, and he was in my office, and he was trying his hand at small talk, and he said, oh, by the way, gee, I ran into a man who attended one of your talks. I said, really? He said, yes, he found your talk rather monotonous. Wow, gosh, he did? Well, actually, no, that didn't happen, but I need practice using bigger words. So please, I beg you, practice on someone else. Well, this is why I think you're here. I think you would long that the world might look differently than it currently looks. And so you want to do something together. You want to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. Mother Teresa, of course, diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So I think you're here this morning because you want to stand against forgetting that. What Martin Luther King said about church could well be said of your time here in this holy place. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to imagine something with God, to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You go from this place to dismantle the barriers that exclude, especially in the times in which we live, where everybody is circling the wagons. You go from this place to widen the circle. And so you go to the edges, to the margins, because the only way to erase them is to locate yourself at them. And you stand with a particularity with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And you get to stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, you have this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And how fortunate you are to be able to stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. You go to the margins and you look under your feet, and the margins are getting erased because you chose to stand there. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused you may well be on those worthy goals, the truth of the matter is they can't happen unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other. And so you go to the margins and you brace yourselves because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You go from here to the margins and other voices get heard. Well, I think none of that makes very much sense were it not for how consequential it is to have a sense of God as spacious and expansive. I'm a Jesuit, so St. Ignatius always talked about the God who's always greater. And I had a spiritual director once who said to me, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because we've settled for a partial, puny God, a lesser God. And we can't. I think we all remember when Dylan Roof killed all those people tragically in Mother Emanuel Church, and I think it was not even a week later when relatives of those who had died stood in front of him and said, "I forgive you," recognizing that they were looking at anguish and mental illness. And everybody felt, yeah, we're in the presence of the God we actually have. And then 9 months later, when they sentenced him to die and they called it God's justice, yeah, you knew we had wandered back to the partial God, the lesser God, the puny God. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and mystic, used to say, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." Nobody really believes that, though, because we think it's still about judgment. We don't really believe in the God who doesn't want anything from us, only wants for us. The homies have broadened my sense of who God is immeasurably. Usually they do it by way of mangling the English language, and I always find it not just charming, but often illuminating. I have so many examples of this. But I had a homegirl named Lisa, a gang member. One of our trainees came into my office at the end of the day. Her man had come to pick her up, and she wanted to introduce him to me. And she says, "This is my sufficient other." I said, "No doubt." And, I'm able to be here with all you good people because I have a CEO who has recently taken over the helm at Homeboy, so I don't have to worry about the day-to-day and the cash flow and meeting payroll and all that stuff. I can be with you. And so I had a homie come into my office and kind of distressed, and he said, "Damn, G, my lady, she's in a bad mood today." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, she's beginning her administration period." I said, "Well, I just finished mine, so kind of know what she's going through." But my favorite one happened when I was presiding at Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and we were in a gym, and it was like 500 gang members, all male, and sitting on folding chairs. And I'm vested in my alb and my stole, and I have this sheet, that has the readings in it, English and Spanish on both sides. And I thought, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed. So I rest the sheet on my lap. And first guy got up and did the first reading, and then the second guy got up and did the responsorial psalm. And there was a kind of an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if you think about it, the exalted God, quite frankly, is a projection. It's, if we were God, we would want to be exalted, let's be honest. It's God created in our own image, and you have to be careful of that because then God gets puny really fast. My friend Ann Lamott always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. And so you have to be on guard, but the exhausted God is spacious and expansive, and it's generous, and no, it's not about me, it's about you. And that's what you hope for, that's what you long for, is to align your heart with this God who loves us without measure and without regret. It wasn't so long ago that I buried my 92-year-old mama, and she had 8 kids and died in her own home, in her own bed. I had buried my father 25 years ago. She was sharp as a tack to the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't one lick afraid of death. She was kind of oddly exhilarated at the prospect of it. A couple weeks before she died, she said to me, "I've never done this before." I mean, it was like something you might say before skydiving. In fact, her last words to me were the day before she died, and I just happened to be there alone with her, and she was asleep. When she woke up, she saw me, and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died. Sorry. Well, the next day, as luck would have it, it was exactly at noon, and again, by just chance, there I was. And right exactly at noon, she opened her eyes, and she let out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I mention all that because in the course of the weeks before she died, she'd be in and out of consciousness. And when she'd wake up, she'd lock on to the one of us, or there'd be 2 or 3 or all 8 of us around her bed. But she'd lock on to only one, and she'd say with breathless delight, "Oh, you're here. You're here." And after I buried her, I thought, I think that's probably the singular agenda item that our God has. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. You receive the tender glance, and you choose to be that tender glance in the world because it's so compelling. What else can you do? It's the God who doesn't want anything from us, just for us. And once you know that God, what could be more consequential in terms of how we are in the world? And then we choose to be in the world who God is, compassionate and loving and kind. What could be more consequential? So this time together is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And it's not just so much about taking the right stand on issues. It's about standing in the right place. It's more humble and it's more effective, actually, when we do that. For it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you, and that's the person we want to be in the world. So all of us sort of begin with service, which is a natural place to begin. But then service is the hallway. You want to get to the ballroom, which is the place of exquisite mutuality, where there is no us and them, there's just us, which is the only place where you can stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. Otherwise, there's a distance even in service provider, service recipient, and you don't want that. I was speaking in Houston, and after a talk, what we would call in the biz a hardcore gang intervention worker came to see me afterwards, and former gang member, former inmate, now working with gang members in the streets, and he kind of pleaded with me, with a very earnest guy. And he says, how do you reach them? Meaning gang members. And I found myself saying, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Which I think we need to turn all that stuff on its head. We do not go to the margins to make a difference. We go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make us different. And so the original covenantal relationship with our exhausted God goes like this. As I have loved you, so must you have a special preferential care and love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God identifies these folks because God thinks these are the people who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these are the folks who happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. You go to the margins so that the widow, orphan, and stranger can alter our hearts forever. That's why you want to get to the ballroom, so there is no distance between service provider, service recipient. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez as a friend. And he was the best listener I've ever been in the presence of. If you were talking to him, he was laser beam focused on you. He was never looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important was on the approach. He looked at you, and it was as if his whole being said, "You're here." But once famously, a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual," which is the hope. How do we arrive at that place where there is no daylight that separates us, even in our service? There was a homie, nobody found more job opportunities through Homeboy Industries than this guy. We all called him Dreamer. He was from a gang in Pico Gardens housing projects. I knew his older brothers. He was a super smart kid with a dangerous sense of humor. He's doing fine now. He's in his early 40s and married, house, kids, good job. But in his early 20s, he was kind of a yo-yo in and out of being locked up. I would find him a job in the private sector or in one of our 9 social enterprises at Homeboy Industries, and he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of, and then he'd wander back to me. And it was a very repetitious pattern that was quite frustrating. So this one time he had finished a 4-month stretch, a probation violation at county jail, and there he is sitting in front of my desk, and he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." And I went, "Oh, okay." So with him sitting there, I picked up the phone. I call a friend of mine named Gary, who runs a vending machine company in Alhambra, California. And Gary had hired homies in the past, lots of them, and I thought, hoping against hope, maybe he'll do it again. And sure enough, Gary says, "Yeah, you tell that guy he can start tomorrow." That's a holy man. So Dreamer began work the next day in the vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. I couldn't believe my eyeballs. I said, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go all over again. But this time he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his very first paycheck and he waves it proudly and he says, "Damn, G, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, who?" And he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, God, of course." I said, "Oh, sure, no, that's right. That would be God." You thought I was going to say you. I said, "No, gosh. God's number one." He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." I'm sorry, them Genesis days? He goes, "Yeah, because God would have been had struck down your ass already by now." Oh my God, the two of us, we literally fell out of our chairs and we were howling with laughter. And I defy you to identify exactly who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. Well, Homeboy was born a long time ago, 1988, when I was the pastor of the poorest parish in the city, Dolores Mission, nestled in the middle of two public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other when I was pastor. LAPD called my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in all of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 227th 3 months ago. Not all from that community, but I run a very large gang intervention program. I get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And so they were wreaking havoc in the projects. They were violent, selling drugs, writing on walls. So I walked out to them and I would kind of isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one said, "Yeah, I would." And then I couldn't, find a school that would take them. So it kind of forced my hand. So right across the street from the church is our elementary school, and first 2 floors it were grades K to 8, but the entire 3rd floor was the convent. And so one evening I gathered all the nuns together in the living room and I sat them down and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out and we could turn the convent into a school for gang members?" And they looked at each other and they went, "Sure," and that was the extent of their discernment process. And so this brought gang members in large numbers to our church property, and which created something of a disconnect. Parishioners would say to me, "Yeah, excuse me, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out," which was a good gospel challenge. And then the homie said, if only we had jobs so myself and the women in the parish, mainly only women live in the projects, we marched around the factories that surrounded the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that didn't work out so well. And then, so we invented things, different crews, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of rival enemy gang members from the 8 gangs in the parish. Then in 1992, the unrest happened after the Rodney King verdict, and the whole city, every pocket of poverty just ignited, except the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, and I said, well, maybe it had something to do with the fact that we had 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members working side by side. So they had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. And so this article appeared in the LA Times, and well, the next day, a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million, summoned me to his office, and he said, "How should I spend my money?" And as I look back on it now, I see that I woefully undershot my request, but I was young. And I said, well, there's a tore-up bakery right across the street from the school. It's got ovens. They don't work, but we could fix them. We could put hair nets on enemy rival gang members. They could bake bread. We could call the place Homeboy Bakery. And that was the extent of my business plan. And he said, sure. So we wrote a big check, and we were off and running. A month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for Future, which is what we previously called ourselves, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved here. Not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever intends to do such a thing, but we backed our way, we evolved our way into now we're the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on our planet. We never intended to do that, but it happened. So 15,000 folks a year come through our doors. The homies all want to be a part of the 18-month training program because it's a paid gig. We want them to be part of it because it's a healing place where they can find some rest from their chronic toxic stress, and they can find something of a sanctuary. And then they become the sanctuary that they sought, and then they go home and provide that sanctuary to their kids, and for the first time you've broken a cycle. So everybody's in therapy. We have lots of classes, 12-step programs, case management, navigators, free tattoo removal. No place on the planet removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic, 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, 47 volunteer doctors, 11,000 treatments. So if any of you are starting to regret that CTS tattoo you have, see me afterwards. And then we have all our 9 social enterprises. The bakery is going strong, and Homeboy Silk Screen, Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise. We have a restaurant at LAX, Terminal 4. Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall in Los Angeles. Farmers markets. We have a thing called Homeboy Grocery, where we sell chips, salsas, and guacamole on 2 chains on either coast, on both coasts rather. And Homeboy Recycling, where we recycle e-waste. I'd like to give a shout out to Recycle Force. Are you here? Yeah. Completely worthy of your support. We have solar panel installation training. What else do we have? We have Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. It's kind of a who's who, with a lot of celebs and electeds. Vice President Joe Biden came once with an entourage and Secret Service, and when he was vice president, and selfies with Uncle Joe, and he was quite affectionate with the homies. They didn't seem to mind. I'll be honest with you. Jim Carrey, Jack Black, lots of movie stars. Once Diane Keaton came, Oscar winner, movie star, Her waitress was Glenda, and Glenda's a big girl, been there, done that, tattooed felon. She doesn't know who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order, and Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 dishes she really likes, and then Diane Keaton says, well, I'll have that second one. That one sounds good. And then suddenly something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you from somewhere. Like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to deflect it humbly and, oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda says, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Well, that just took my breath away, and I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings, now that I think of it. But suddenly, kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind, and we need go no further than to hear Jesus speak to the gathered, that you shall be one. I suppose he could have made it more self-referential, but because he's the image of our exhausted God, it's about us and not about him, that you may be one. All of us are called to go from this place today to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy, we're allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. Instead of doing that, and the reason we don't do that is because our exhausted God has no interest in it. So why would we do it? Instead, we hold the mirror up and tell people the truth, knowing that we're all born wanting the same thing and we all happen to have the same truth, that we are all exactly what God had in mind when God made us. And then you watch folks, especially those on the margins, as they inhabit that truth, as they become that truth, and no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But at Homeboy, we know that you have to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Marcus Borg, the great scripture scholar, said that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think that's, of course, quite right. There's an odd line in the Acts of the Apostles that'll just leap out at you, and it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it seems to suggest that the measure of health in any community, including this one, could well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was one of those things they call a gang in-service. So it's from 9 to 5 in a hotel ballroom and lots of workshops and keynotes. And I said yes, figuring, maybe I'd do a keynote or speak at lunch or close the day. And so I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pulled out the original invitation letter, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself, oh, hell no. So I invited 2 homies in, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down, and they're trainees, and they're like in their 8th months in our 18-month training program. And I sit them down, and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose got up first, and about 25 years old, and gang member, been to prison, tattooed. He was at a certain phase in our different phases in our 18-month program that he sort of landed as a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he's helping younger homies with their addiction issues. So we had a stretch in prison, but he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So Jose got up in front of 600 social workers and he said, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. We got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I guess I was 9, he continued, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door and she says, I found this kid, and she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. My grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. So let me end with this. I was interviewed once on the Christian Broadcast Network, and this woman asked me, what do we do at Homeboy Industries? And so I gave the litany of tattoo removal and job placement and job training and enemies working side by side with each other in a place of healing, a community of tenderness. I went on and on. When I stopped, she kind of made a face and she said, yeah, but how much time each day do you spend at Homeboy? You know, praising God. And I didn't know what to say. So I said, all damn day. And I don't think she liked that answer. But it begs this question: what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So it occurs to people, universities, to force their students to read my books against their will. I'm not complaining. But my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, who ruined my bracket, they invited me. They forced the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. So they said, could you come? And we're going to have a big venue with 1,000 people. And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I do if people are going to pay for it and the trips aren't too complicated, too many stops. And I always pick homies in the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals among our trainees just to force them to share a hotel room together and just to mess with them. And then I always pick homies who have never flown before just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. Wasn't that long ago, I was at LAX and 2 older vatos were there, and one guy, dead serious, said to me, hey, G, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, yeah, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked these 2 guys, Bobby, an African-American gang member who worked in the bakery, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. And I've done this almost 1,000 times probably, but I've never picked a homie more absolutely petrified of flying like this guy, Mario. He was hyperventilating, and we hadn't even boarded the plane, and so we're at Burbank Airport, and it's the airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines. They don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You walk out into the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb the steps to board the front of the plane and steps at the back of the plane. So I'm sitting there with Mario. Bobby's off walking somewhere. It's early morning. Our plane arrives, and people are deplaning. And I said, Mario, that's going to be our plane. And I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb those stairs. And so then I see our flight crew arrives and pilots, and there are 2 flight attendants, females. Both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Okay, perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that in our 31-year history at Homeboy Industries, Mario is the most tattoo individual who's ever worked there, which is saying a lot. He's all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And so I'm trying to calm him down. I'm walking through the airport, and I've never been in public with him, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody and say, who's the kindest, most gentle soul here, they won't say me. They'll say Mario. He's a waiter in the cafe. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga. There's a big talk Tuesday night. They don't tell you that there are 93 other talks they've planned in classes and meetings. And I tell these 2, you guys get up. I'm going to sit in the back of the class. They were nervous, especially Mario, but they do a good job. Stories of torture and terror and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of their childhoods. So we get to the main talk, and I get them up to do 7 minutes each, and so that I can include them in the question and answer. I do my thing. I invite them to stand on either side, and yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I have a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario is this tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone. He's just terrified. Yes. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario clutches the microphone even more intently, and he's starting to tremble, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say when suddenly he blurts out, As soon as he says those two words, he retreats back to his microphone clutching, closed-eyed refuge. But he wants to get this whole sentence out, and I know he's now losing the battle with his tears. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they were returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you, where you receive the tender glance and you choose to be that tender glance, and you go to the margins, not to make a difference, but so that the widow, orphan, and the stranger make us different. And you go to the margins and you expand the circle of compassion so that no one is standing outside of it, and you look in each other's eyes and you say, you're here. And you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.
Father Greg, thank you for sharing your story and these stories, and even more so your spirit, and allowing us to experience kinship with you and be inspired by it. We're going to have a time of a moderated conversation with Father Greg, and for that, I want to introduce Dr. Michael Twyman, who is a civic leader and member of the Faith and Action Advisory Board. Dr. Twyman is the principal owner of In Excelsis, a private consulting firm which works with organizations seeking to maximize their performance and effectiveness. And as a subject matter expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion, he is a highly sought presenter, trainer, facilitator, and media contributor on topics dealing with education, health, workforce development, and public safety. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Twyman and Father Greg.
Good morning, everyone. So, we have some prepared questions, and we're going to also have an opportunity to have some questions that have been sent to us by others ahead of time that we will entertain as well. Starting off, when you were studying to become a priest, did you have any idea whatsoever, did you ever imagine that the work that you're doing now is what your calling would be?
No.
This is going to be a short interview.
I don't know how to elaborate on that, except that, I was in Bolivia. Maybe that had something to do with it, and it kind of turned my heart inside out. And where the poor evangelize you and help you to put first things recognizably first and invite you to live as though the truth were true. And so, again, I really believe in backing one's way into stuff. I don't, you listen, you react, you respond. But I didn't chart out anything. I didn't set out to do anything. And nothing prepared me. Not theological study, nothing. So, which is good, I think that's the way it should be. Because then you're all reception rather than I have this message that people need to hear or something. Even with Spanish, my Spanish kind of sucked in the beginning, and so I couldn't lead people. I had to follow the people of God, and it felt like that's the way it should be anyway. And so that was kind of magical and empowering, So, but I nothing prepared me, and I didn't see it coming.
So as it relates to Homeboy Industries, what would you, looking back, of course, hindsight being 20/20, they say, what do you know now that you wish you would have known from the very beginning?
Well, I can identify two, maybe three kind of key things. One was in the early days, because I had 8 gangs, I kind of, worked with gangs and not just gang members. And that was misguided. I don't regret that I did it, but I'd never do it again, because there was a notion that kind of said, this is about conflict resolution, and if only we can sit the sides down and shuttle diplomacy and peace treaties and truces. So I did all that stuff, riding my bike in the middle of the night in the projects. But gang violence is a language, it's about a lethal absence of hope. And I started to understand that no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang. So gang violence is, there's violence in it, but there's no conflict. It's not about anything. It's not the Middle East or Northern Ireland. And then if you work with gangs, you're supplying oxygen to gangs. You're serving the cohesion of gangs, which is a really bad idea. So I learned that lesson. The second lesson I learned was I listened to gang members, and they said if only we had jobs. So we were job-centric. We had a T-shirt that had a motto, nothing stops a bullet like a job. And then 15 years in, you're not just listening to gang members, you know gang members. And then you know, oh no, healing is what needs to happen. So an educated inmate or gang member may or may not go back to prison, or an employed one may or may not. But we've come to see at Homeboy, it's an absolute total guarantee that a healed gang member will not reoffend. So we changed in mid-course. We're 31 years old now, but about 15 years in, we went, no, this, healing first. And then the third thing, I guess, would be, and this was the thing to stave off my own burnout. So I don't believe in compassion fatigue. I don't believe in depletion. I tell my staff, if you're depleted in doing this work, I suspect you're doing it incorrectly. If you're depleted in burning out, well, then it's about you. But if it's about them and us, If it's about an other, then it's endlessly replenishing. And so I think saving lives is really for the Coast Guard. I'm kind of not interested in it. You want to accompany people, you want to receive people, you want to allow yourself to be reached and altered by folks at the margins. And the odd thing is that's the thing that leads us all to an unshakable sense of our goodness and our dignity, and we do that together. So those would be the three kind of lessons.
So, did you ever find, or do you still find, that there are times or spaces where you feel either inadequate or incompetent?
Well, that's daily, but it doesn't bother me, because I don't really care about success. I believe with Mother Teresa that we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. So you want to kind of lock on to a strategy and a methodology that's loving, good, and true, and right, and just, and then just put one foot in front of the next. But if it's about outcomes, brace yourself, because then you're going to be disappointed. But the second you're freed of outcomes, then all you care about is loving, being loving. And that's a free place to be. So I don't do disappointment. I don't do setback. I don't do failure. And that's mainly because I don't do outcomes, success, and measurable progress, Funders don't like that very much, but but if your engine is success, then you're going to only work with people who are most likely to succeed. But if you just care about loving, then you're going to go to exactly the people who are least likely, or at least by the standards that are out there. And you're going to accompany and walk with the folks who are really despised and left out. The folks nobody else will walk with. That's what you want. That's where the joy is.
On its face, it would seem that maybe you don't have a lot of common in terms of life experience with many of the people with whom you come in contact at Homeboys. But what do you really feel at the core you do share in common with Homeboy?
Well, I think that's another thing I've learned. I remember a group of Georgetown students came. We always have tours at our headquarters at Homeboy Industries. So they were there for an immersion trip. They were baking bread in the bakery and the whole 9 yards for 5 days. And so at one point they had a moment with me up in the classroom. And a young woman with kind of a fair amount of hostility in her voice. She said, "What makes you qualified to do this work?" I went, "Damn." And I didn't know what to say, so I put my fingers lightly on my wrist and I said, "A pulse." And I think that's actually correct. If you are the proud owner of a pulse, why would you disqualify yourself? I think the danger always is, of course, forgetting that this is a human thing, and so we disqualify ourselves all the time. I'm not a gang member, I don't have tattoos, I didn't grow up in the projects. And then we forget that this is about human beings and that you connect. And I go to a lot of cities, and here's how I think you measure health. If a city's response to such youth as gangs or disaffected youth, or violence even, is rarefied, specialized, step aside, let me handle this, we're going in there, it's a dangerous job, kind of romanticized and dramatic, that's unhealthy. If it's all hands on deck, find me somebody who can't be a beneficial presence to this vexing social dilemma. Well, now we've moved into health. That's health. And you want to keep it healthy. The broader, the more hands-on deck it is, the better. I can remember in the early days, I was like this only white guy but I was doing the work, so it was hard to contend with me. And I'd be at these meetings with gang members, guys who were doing hardcore gang intervention work, and, African Americans, Latinos, and there was me. And there was always come that moment, they'd kind of, well, Father, we have so much respect for you, but gang members are going to listen to us more than they're going to listen to you. And I always would say the same thing. I go, you're absolutely right. If the task is yakking at them. But since the task is listening to them, receiving them, allowing yourself to be reached by who they are, who can't do that? And that breaks the whole thing open, it seems to me. But I've never had a gang member ever say, well, what do you know about it? And partly because I don't yak. You listen, and you allow your heart to be altered forever by them. And then together you're kind of inhabiting this space where everybody knows their own nobility. So many Buddhist texts begin with, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." Well, that's what you do with folks. I had a woman come to Homeboy, and she said, I have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries. And I said, why do you have to volunteer at Homeboy Industries? Well, I believe I have a message these young people need to hear. I went, yikes. I said, do me a favor, the second you lose that message, come on back to us. But I think that's the way it should be. Can you receive people?
Some say that we, as a society, struggle with lamenting or finding the value in being able to lament, and even people of faith. You talk about owning your wounds in order to be able to heal others. Expound upon that whole journey and what that looks like. How, when folks feel that their tank is already low and that they're hurt to the point that they can't be of any service to others, what's the transition?
Well, I always say that lament can't get a foothold if gratitude gets there first. So there's a guy who works for us named Cisco. He's been shot 33 times. He was in the hospital for a year and 2 months. 6 months of that, he was in a coma. So he walks with some difficulty, and his speech is a little bit, you listen to him and you think, has he been drinking? It's kind of that kind of tone. And he's just a magnificent guy. And some surly homegirl who works at Homeboy just found his positive nature kind of annoying. And so she said, why are you always smiling and laughing? And he looked at her and put his hand on her arm and said, I've been through too much not to laugh. And so there's a kind of a wisdom born of being anchored in the present moment, which is kind of the whole thing. I had two homies that we went to Chicago, and this one guy, Jose, this was 2 weeks ago, and he had never flown before. So we were in the Southwest Airlines line, and waiting to board, and he has kind of a loud-ass voice. So he says, hey, G, can I turn my phone on airplane mode, And I turn around and I go, well, you can still use your phone, but even on the plane. But once they close that door, you turn it to airplane mode. And he turns to a woman behind him, total stranger, and he goes, I've never done airplane mode before. And the look on the woman's face was great, yeah, And I remember thinking about it later. I thought, wow, he was inviting both of us to what the poet Rumi calls to live in the infinite moment when everything happens. And that's exactly where you want to live. That's the risen life. You know, the resurrection is not about yesterday. It's about right this second. And that's where you want to be anchored. So I can't remember what the question was, but
You answered it.
yeah, okay.
In the current climate we are, which arguably is a very tense social political atmosphere relative to divisions and divisiveness, where is the bridge and the call to bring folks who are often so divided to step into the margin?
Well, this is probably why I'm kind of shy on policy, you know, because we kind of cut out the middleman when it comes to policy. We want to deal with things head on. I just read about my alma mater, Gonzaga in Spokane, that they started a hate class. The class was called Hate. And again, I get it. You know, it's like we're going to address hate head on. And I go, yeah, except that hate's about something else. So I think everything is about something else, you know. Even in the tragic Poway shooting in California in the synagogue, and there was an op-ed piece by the rabbi who had survived, you know. And you know, I was shot because this man hated Jews. I go, yeah, I don't know, someday we'll acknowledge that we belong to each other and that people are mentally ill. Someday we will. It's a little bit like Jesus. I love Jesus. But when he saw a guy having seizures and convulsions, he thought he was possessed by a demon. And no, he had epilepsy. And Jesus was wrong. And that's okay because he was a man of his time. But if you look at somebody shooting up a synagogue and you go, oh, okay, he's anti-Semitic. I go, I was going to go with mental illness, but when John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan and said it was because of Jodie Foster, nobody said, well, we're going to address this head on and deal with celebrity obsession. Nobody said that. He didn't spend a minute in a jail or in a prison. I don't know why we were able to make that transition to say, no, this guy needs help. Clearly, he's sick. And I think it's a frontier because if it's about hate or white supremacists or racism or anti-Semitism, then it has to be about those things because then we can otherize people. And it's self-congratulatory. We want to say we are addressing hate head on. I go, good luck with that. We are addressing white supremacists. And it's a way of saying not all of us belong to each other. And it's like insisting that somebody with epilepsy is possessed by a demon. I hate to break it to you. There are no demons anywhere. Here's a pill, and that'll help control your seizures. So I wish we could be better at that. I think it's the next frontier. The largest mental institution on the planet Earth is LA County Jail. What does that tell you? What a bad diagnosis we've made. People act out. I learned this at a mini scale at Homeboy. Nobody at Homeboy gets tripped up by behavior. Nobody demonizes anybody. Nobody banishes anybody. Nobody says, that's a bad person who just acted out in that way. Everybody knows that it's a language. So we want to understand what language you're speaking right now when you just hit that guy in the face. And then you stand in awe at what people have to carry. I had 2 nephews. I don't ever talk about this, so I get. But both hung themselves 5 years apart, both carrying the most unspeakable anguish, both mentally ill and had inherited this from their father. And I don't know, we could talk about behavior, I guess, but that's not helping anybody. And that's why I only talk about we belong to each other as opposed to policy, because nothing will ever change until that's in our gut. And then we go, you know what? Dylan Roof did a horrible thing and he belongs to us. Donald Trump belongs to us. If it doesn't mean that, then it's meaningless. Then it's the same otherizing that everybody else engages in, especially in these times of tribalism where everybody circles the wagon. We don't want to. We want to widen the circle.
I often attribute some of my defiance to my Jesuit education. How important is irreverence to social justice? You're kind of on the irreverent side, just a tad.
I thought I had sort of cleaned it up. I cut out all sorts of things, you know. Also, reverence? Irreverence. Yeah, you know, I don't know. You know, it's funny. I talk sometimes. I begin, and I don't know why I didn't do it here, because we're in a church or something. But I talked about this kid, Lewis, who was kind of a force of nature and ran our place for like 10 years, and heroin addict, big shot caller from his gang, a wonderful guy, but he used to give talks, you know, and he was in demand. High schools would ask for him by name, you know, and he liked speaking. So we went out to dinner, and he was giving me tips on how to speak publicly, and he said, you know, G, you gotta pepper your talk with self-defecating humor. And I said, yeah, no shit. So I didn't say that at the beginning, because I thought, well, I'm in a church or something. But then I was thinking to myself, and I've had people walk out, I can't even believe it, you know, and other things too that I've said. But you know, Richard Rohr says, only the false self is ever offended by anything. And that's so true. And part of the thing is you want to arrive at the truth of who you are. And a homie the other day said about his experience at Homeboy, he said, all of us here, everybody's been to prison, of course, and he says, all of us here, we're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. And the thing that keeps us from seeing each other is our false self, the thing that gets offended, and then you circle the wagons, and then I'm connecting to my tribe, and we scapegoat, and the whole Rene Girard thing, you know, about the distance, the high moral distance, and I'm not that guy who killed those people. He doesn't belong to me. And I think God's heart is broken by that, because that's God's dream come true. We think it's this. Oh, God, you're amazing. Yeah, well, God, I have a homie who writes me every morning an email. I call him my spiritual director, Sergio. And he says, you know, there are just some things that put Jesus to sleep. And that would be one of the things, you know, the notion that we're saying, oh, my God, you're so compassionate, when God is just waiting for us to be compassionate. And I think that's sort of key, you know, I think part of the spiritual task is to, you know, find the things that put Jesus to sleep and then avoid them, you know.
You had mentioned, this is more of an administrative type questions, but I think some members in our audience would be curious, that you now have a CEO of Homeboy Industries. Talk a little bit about that leadership shift and succession? Was it something that was planned, or how's it freed you up? And just a little bit about that.
Well, so we were started 31 years ago. Now we're a $20 million annual operation. So half of that money is generated by our 9 social enterprises. And the other half we have to raise, which is a heavy lift. We get 1% from government, which I never use the word sinful, but I'll use it in that case, because that's just sinful that we would, because we're so huge in LA County. There are 120,000 gang members in LA County. All the chiefs of police in the last 15 years, kind of tipped their hat to Homeboy because, we had 1,000 gang-related homicides in 1992, and they've been cut in half and then cut in half again. And anybody who knows the county of Los Angeles knows what role Homeboy has played in that, because we're kind of the exit ramp off this crazy violent freeway. And when you didn't have an exit ramp, it compounded the despair of gang members, and that increased the violence. But the fact that we only get 1% of, government, and part of that is we're victims of our own success. People go, oh, they got businesses, they'll be fine. It's just really hard. So I'm grateful to have a CEO who does that. But beyond that is having the homies who have taken charge. They run the place. In Chautauqua, I was, in Chautauqua, if you've ever been there, Chautauqua Institute, I had 6 homies there, 3 homegirls and 3 homies, and they did kind of a lunchtime talk, and I snuck in the back, and nobody knew I was there, and I was listening to them, and packed, standing room only, and some older lady got up, and she said, well, what's going to happen to Homeboy? Father Greg, he's going to die, which was right out there, and they just blanch, and he's not going to live forever, so what's going to happen to Homeboy when he goes? One of the homies just stood up, and he gestured at the other 5, and he said, we all got keys to the place. And people burst into applause, and they nodded, and I said, as they say on game shows, good answer. And I think that's true. I think, the succession funders used to ask that maybe 15 years ago. They don't ask it anymore, because once you walk in the place, you know that the culture of the place has been embraced by everybody. And so.
Yeah, all right.
Well, Dr. Michael Twyman, thank you very much.